Daniel Harris was 38 years old, but his body felt much older. Years of service in the Navy had left their marks in aching back that never let him rest, scars that told stories no one asked to hear, and eyes that still carried shadows of the ocean's darkest nights. When he left the service, he imagined he could start over, build a quiet life with his daughter Emily. Instead, life narrowed down to survival, day by day, hour by hour. The Charleston harbor became their reluctant home. Amid the sound of gulls and the scent of salt water, Daniel pitched an old tent behind a row of shipping containers. The canvas was torn, patched in places with duct tape, its flaps rattling whenever the wind rose. Inside, there was barely room for 2 sleeping bags, a small lantern, and a wooden chest, his only remaining link to the man he once was. Every evening, Daniel tucked Emily in, pulling the thin blanket higher around her shoulders. She was 12 when, at the fragile age where children start to see the cracks in their parents' armor. She rarely complained, but her silence weighed heavier than words. Sometimes he caught her watching him as if she were studying his every move, measuring his strength, trying to decide if he was still the hero she believed him to be. Meals were simple, often scavenged or donated. Daniel took day jobs when he could hauling ropes at the docks, unloading shipments, but his back betrayed him. A sharp pain would seize him without warning, leaving him gasping, forcing him to slow down. Employers noticed. Sympathy quickly turned to impatience, and work became scarcer each week. The hunger that gnawed at him was nothing compared to the guilt of seeing Emily pick at her food, pretending she wasn't still hungry when she was. The harbor community knew them. Some offered brief kindness, an apple left by a market stall, an extra sandwich wrapped in paper, but kindness always came wrapped in pity. More often, there were whispers. Mothers tugged their children closer as they passed. Dock workers muttered that Daniel had let himself go, that a real man would find a way. Each glance was a blade, reminding him of what he had lost. Not just his home or his job, but the respect of the world around him. At night, when the harbor quieted and the lantern burned low, Daniel sat outside the tent staring at the water. The reflection of the city lights shimmered across the waves, unreachable. He remembered the man he used to be, confident, strong, standing tall in uniform. The Navy had once given him purpose, camaraderie, a place in the world. Now, stripped of all that, he felt like a ghost haunting the edges of a city that had moved on without him. Emily would sometimes join him in the silence, wrapping her small hands around a chipped mug of tea. She never asked about the war, never pressed him about the scars or the nightmares that woke him in a cold sweat. She only asked when things would get better. Daniel would answer the same way each time, his voice steady even when his heart faltered. "Soon, sweetheart. Soon." But deep inside, Daniel knew soon was a promise he could no longer keep. He was a man caught between who he had been and who he had become, and that gap widened with every passing day. The fallen hero sat in the shadows of Charleston's harbor, trying to hold his world together with nothing more than grit and love for his daughter. Yet beneath the weight of despair, a spark still lingered, small, fragile, but alive. And though he could not see it yet, that spark was waiting for its chance to burn. Morning in Charleston often began with the clang of ship bells and the shrill cries of gulls. For most families, it was a sound that blended with routine coffee brewing in kitchens, children hurrying to catch the school bus. But for Daniel Harris and his daughter Emily, mornings meant folding thin blankets inside their ragged tent, brushing off the dampness that had crept in overnight, and stepping into a world that never let them forget where they belonged. The walk to school was always the hardest. Emily carried her worn backpack, its zippers broken and patched with thread. She kept her head down, eyes fixed on the cracked sidewalks, as if the ground could shield her from the voices around her. Children who once might have played with her now whispered cruelly when she passed. Some tugged at their friends' sleeves, pointing at her clothes at the way her shoes were scuffed beyond repair. Others hissed the words she dreaded most. There goes the homeless girl. Inside the classroom, the judgment followed her. When projects required supplies, Emily improvised, piecing together scraps from what her father found near the docks. The teacher's sympathetic glance was almost worse than the children's cruelty. It marked her as different, a charity case in a world that valued normalcy above all else. She sat at the edge of groups, rarely chosen, never fully included. At recess, when laughter echoed across the playground, Emily often found herself sitting alone, sketching in a tattered notebook her father had salvaged from a trash bin. She drew ships, oceans, and stars, images of freedom, as if she could sail herself away from the stares that cut so deeply. Daniel knew. He saw it in her eyes each afternoon when she returned from school, the way her shoulders sagged with invisible weight. She never told him outright, but he caught fragments of truth in her pauses, in the way she avoided mirrors, in how she held herself smaller than she was, hoping to disappear. Each time his chest tightened with a mix of anger and helplessness. At the harbor, the judgment was harsher, delivered without the hesitation of children. Dock workers eyed him with disdain when he asked about jobs. Some smirked, muttering that he was a washed-up veteran, a man hiding behind old uniforms and old excuses. Women passing by clutched their purses tighter, assuming poverty was just another word for danger. Even those who offered kindness, a bag of food, an old jacket, did so with an air of superiority, as if reminding him of his place. Daniel's pride smoldered under the weight of it. There were moments when words rose in his throat, sharp and furious, begging to be unleashed against the sneers and whispers. Yet he swallowed them down. He knew that if he exploded, even once, the image of a desperate, unstable man would spread faster than any truth about who he really was. Silence became his armor, and dignity his last shield. But dignity was fragile. Each night when Emily was asleep, Daniel let the mask slip. He sat outside the tent with his head in his hands, torn between fury at the world and shame at himself. He wanted to be the father who could give Emily a warm bed, a steady meal, and the simple security of belonging. Instead, he was the man who told her fairy tales of better days, even when he no longer believed in them himself. The city did not forgive weakness. Charleston, with its proud facades and thriving harbor, had no patience for those who fell behind. For every neighbor who offered a sympathetic smile, there were 10 others who scoffed. They judged him not for his scars or his service, but for the tent, the hunger, and the daughter who bore the cost of his failures. And yet, in the quiet between the storms of shame, Daniel clung to one unshaken truth. Emily. Her presence was an anchor that kept him steady, the reminder that even if the world turned its back, he still had a duty. Pride might be bruised, dignity might be battered, but love, that was the one thing they could not strip from him. Still, the tension between who he was inside and how the world saw him grew sharper every day. Pride told him to stand tall, to keep his head high. Reality told him he was sinking, and the whispers that followed Emily like shadows were proof of how far they had fallen. He lived caught between the two, pulled taut like a rope ready to snap. And though he endured in silence, the judgment of the harbor and the cruelty of the schoolyard were chiseling cracks into both father and daughter. Sooner or later, those cracks would widen, and what had been buried, the pain, the anger, the truth, would demand to be seen. The harbor had always been Daniel's last refuge. Even when the city turned its back on him, even when the whispers followed him and Emily like shadows, he could still find work at the docks. It wasn't steady, and it wasn't kind, but it gave him a sense of purpose, hauling ropes, guiding crates, doing the labor that kept ships moving. He told himself that as long as he could earn even a few dollars, he could keep his pride intact. could still prove to Emily that he was fighting. But that morning, the fight came to an end. The sun was just cresting the horizon, streaking the water with light, when Daniel felt a sharp twist in his back again. He tried to push through it, gritting his teeth, forcing his body to obey. But the crate in his arms slipped. It landed hard on the dock, sending a dull thud echoing across the planks. The foreman's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Damn it, Harris. I told you we can't afford mistakes. You're slowing the whole crew down." Daniel straightened, sweat pouring down his temples. "It was one crate. I can keep going." But the foreman shook his head, his patience already gone. "You've been a liability for weeks. I gave you chances. You're done here." The words landed heavier than any blow. Daniel stood frozen, his chest tightening, his pride collapsing inward. Around him, the other dock workers pretended not to look, but he could feel their eyes, could hear their muttered relief that it was him and not them. He wanted to argue, to shout that he wasn't useless, that he had once carried men through storms and fire, that he had stood unshaken when the sea tried to kill him. But no words came. Instead, he lowered his gaze, nodded once, and walked away. The pay he had earned was barely enough for food that night. As he trudged back toward the tent, each step felt heavier, as though the weight of failure had climbed onto his shoulders. He thought of Emily, waiting, hungry, expecting him to come back with hope. How could he tell her this was the end of even the little stability they had left? By the time he reached the tent, dusk had settled over the harbor. Emily was inside, sketching in her notebook by the light of the lantern. She looked up with a smile that faltered the moment she saw his face. "Dad? What happened?" Daniel forced a smile he didn't feel. "Nothing you need to worry about. Just a long day." But after she drifted to sleep, her steady breathing filling the silence, Daniel could no longer contain the storm inside him. He stepped outside, the night air sharp against his skin. His hands shook, his chest burned, and his pride, the last fragile thread he had clung to, finally snapped. With a sudden burst of rage, he dragged the old naval chest from the corner of the tent. It was battered, its brass corners tarnished, its surface scarred from years of travel. It was the only thing he had carried home from the service, the only relic of the man he once was. He dropped to his knees before it, breathing hard, his fists clenched. He tried to open it gently at first, lifting the latch with trembling hands. But when the lid stuck, his control shattered. With a roar that seemed to tear from the depths of his chest, he slammed his fist against the wood. Once, twice, over and over, until the lock snapped and the chest flew open. Inside lay fragments of a past life, a folded uniform, faded photographs of men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him, medals dulled by time. He tore through them, desperate, searching for something, anything that would remind him he was still more than what the world now saw. His hands closed around a ragged piece of cloth. He pulled it free and found himself staring at an old naval flag, its edges frayed, its colors dulled but still recognizable. For a moment he just held it, breathing hard, his tears falling onto the fabric. It was more than cloth. It was memory, sacrifice, honor. It was proof that once, long ago, he had belonged to something larger than himself. But as he turned the flag over in his hands, something caught his eye. A seam along the edge was thicker, heavier than it should have been, as if it had been stitched deliberately. Frowning, Daniel's fingers traced the line. Slowly, carefully, he pried it open, and tucked inside, hidden for years, was an envelope. He froze, staring at it in disbelief, his heart pounding. Whatever was inside that envelope had been meant for him, yet somehow kept from him all this time. With trembling fingers, Daniel tore it open, pulling out the folded papers within. His eyes scanned the words, and the world around him seemed to stop. The broken man, cast aside and forgotten, now held in his hands a truth that could change everything. The night air clung to Daniel like a shroud as he sat hunched over the open naval chest. His hands shook as they sifted through the artifacts of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. There were medals dulled to bronze shadows, ribbons frayed and curling at the edges, and dog tags that clinked softly together like distant echoes of men who had once trusted him with their lives. Each object was a reminder of a man who had stood proud, a man the world had once saluted. Now they lay forgotten, just like him, buried at the bottom of a chest as if their meaning had expired the day he was discharged. But it was the flag that drew him in. The cloth felt heavier than its weight should allow, as though it carried not just fabric but memory. Daniel lifted it carefully, letting it unfold across his knees. Time had not been kind. The navy blue had dulled to gray, the stars nearly worn away, the seams unraveling where salt and wind had gnawed at it. He traced the edges with his fingers, recalling the night it had flown above the rescue convoy, whipping wildly against the storm while he and his men fought for survival. That flag had seen fire, blood, and water blacker than night. It was not pristine, but it was real, as scarred as he was. As his hand slid along one corner, he noticed the stitching thicker than the rest, uneven, not part of the original seam. His brow furrowed. Something about it was deliberate, almost secretive. A flicker of curiosity cut through his despair. He pulled at the seam with careful fingers, tugging until the thread loosened. The fabric gave way, revealing a small, weathered envelope tucked inside, sealed tight and yellow with age. Daniel's breath caught. He stared at it as though it might vanish if he blinked. For a long moment, he couldn't bring himself to open it. His heart pounded in his chest, louder than the waves crashing against the pier. Finally, with hands trembling, he slid a finger under the flap and tore it open. Inside was a letter, folded crisply despite the years, along with a single certificate stamped with the Navy seal. Daniel unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the words. At first they blurred in the lantern's dim glow, and he thought perhaps fatigue was playing tricks on him. But then the truth sharpened, each line cutting deeper than the last. He had been nominated for the Silver Star. The commendation described his actions in detail, how he had led a daring rescue of a convoy of fishermen caught in a storm, how he had risked his life to guide their ships to safety while others faltered. The certificate praised his courage, his leadership, his sacrifice. His name, Daniel Harris, was written clearly, alongside the recommendation that he be honored with one of the nation's highest awards for valor. Yet at the bottom, the document carried a mark that turned his stomach. Recommendation not approved, deferred, reason, political sensitivity. The phrase was cold, detached, a bureaucratic stamp that reduced his sacrifice to a liability. His bravery had not been denied because it was lacking, but because it was inconvenient. Daniel's throat tightened. His hand clenched around the paper until it crumpled. He could still hear the cries of the fishermen that night, still feel the sting of rain in his eyes, still remember the roar of the ocean threatening to devour them all. He had given everything in that storm, his strength, his body, his courage, and had believed that sacrifice meant something. And yet, here it was, proof that his courage had been buried under politics, hidden away in a flag no one would ever see. Rage rose inside him, fierce and hot, overwhelming the years of silence he had endured. His chest heaved as betrayal washed over him, wave after wave. They had stolen his honor. They had let him walk away thinking he was forgotten, unworthy, a man whose service had ended without recognition. And all the while, the truth had been here, stitched into a flag, locked in a chest, waiting to be discovered like some cruel joke. He pressed the papers against his chest, his teeth gritted, his eyes burning with tears he could no longer hold back. For years he had carried the shame of being invisible, of believing he had left nothing behind but scars. For years, he had allowed the whispers and the pity to convince him that perhaps he truly was a failure. Now, staring at the letter, he knew the truth. He had been a hero, and they had stolen that from him. Outside, the harbor winds howled as if echoing his fury. Daniel rose unsteadily to his feet, the letter trembling in his hands. His whole body shook, not just from rage, but from the unbearable weight of betrayal. He wanted to shout, to tear the night apart with the sound of his voice, to demand answers from men who had long since moved on. Instead, he stood in silence, his chest rising and falling with the force of the storm inside him. For the first time in years, Daniel no longer felt broken. He felt dangerous. The truth was in his hands now, and he would not let it be buried again. The next morning, Daniel woke before dawn. Sleep had been impossible, his mind too restless, his chest still burning from what he had uncovered. The letter and the certificate lay folded carefully in his pocket, the weight of them pressing against his ribs like a second heartbeat. He stared at his reflection in the harbor's still water, haggard, unshaven, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. But behind the exhaustion, there was something new, determination. He left Emily sleeping inside the tent, tucked beneath their thin blanket, and walked briskly toward the city. His back throbbed with every step, but he ignored the pain. For the first time in years, he felt a direction pulling him forward. The flag, the letter, the silver star that had been denied him, all of it demanded justice. He had been silent too long. The Veterans Affairs Office sat in a squat brick building near the center of Charleston. Its clean, polished doors felt like a barrier between two worlds. Inside, the promises of honor and service. Outside, men like Daniel, forgotten and discarded. He pushed through the doors with more force than necessary, startling the clerk at the front desk. "I need to speak to someone in charge," he said, his voice sharp, louder than he intended. The young clerk blinked, uneasy at his intensity. "Sir, if you'll just take a seat, someone will—" "I'm not here to sit," Daniel cut him off. His hand slammed the folded papers onto the desk. "I was nominated for the Silver Star. This is my name, my record, my life, and I want to know why it was buried." The clerk stiffened, eyes darting to the papers. Without touching them, he rose and disappeared through a back door. Minutes dragged by, each one tightening the coil in Daniel's chest, until at last two officials emerged, men in suits, their faces carefully composed into masks of bureaucracy. One of them picked up the papers, glanced at them, and exhaled as though Daniel had brought him nothing more than an old receipt. "Mr. Harris, these documents are outdated. Whatever process was considered at the time has long since been closed." "Closed?" Daniel's voice cracked with disbelief. "I risked my life that night. I pulled those men out of the storm when no one else could. I bled for this country, and you're telling me it was filed away like nothing?" The second official raised a hand, his tone calm, almost rehearsed. "We're not denying that you served with courage, but sometimes recommendations are deferred due to political sensitivity. These things happen. It's best to move forward." Daniel's fist clenched. His breath came hard, ragged. "Move forward? You stole my honor. You let me believe I was forgotten, worthless. Do you know what that does to a man? Do you have any idea what it's like to carry the weight of silence while your child—" He stopped himself, his voice breaking, his anger flaring dangerously. The first official, unmoved, slid the papers back across the desk. "Mr. Harris, I suggest you leave this matter where it belongs. In the past, dwelling on it will not change anything. It's too late." Too late. The words cut through him deeper than any wound he had taken in uniform. For a long moment, Daniel just stood there, staring at the papers in front of him, the proof of his courage and the evidence of his betrayal. Around him, the office hummed with the sterile quiet of indifference, the kind of silence that swallowed men whole. Finally, with slow, deliberate movements, he picked up the papers, folded them, and slid them back into his pocket. He didn't trust his voice to answer. He only nodded once, sharply, then turned on his heel and walked out. The late morning sun was blinding as he stepped back onto the street. The world bustled on as if nothing had changed, cars passing, children laughing, vendors calling out their wares. To them, he was just another man moving through the crowd. To him, everything had shifted. Humiliation burned in his gut, heavy and sharp. But beneath it, beneath the shame and the fury, something solid had begun to take shape. The officials thought they had dismissed him, that they had silenced him with cold words and bureaucratic indifference. What they didn't see was the spark they had ignited, the part of him that had been buried for too long, the part that refused to accept erasure. As Daniel walked back toward the harbor, his steps steadied. The rage that had once threatened to consume him was hardening into resolve. If the system would not acknowledge him, then he would find another way. He owed it to himself, to Emily, and to every man who had ever been forgotten. The truth was his weapon now, and he would not let it be buried again. Charleston's harbor seemed quieter than usual that evening, though perhaps it was only Daniel's own silence that made it so. He sat on a weathered bench overlooking the water, the flag folded neatly across his lap, the letter and certificate tucked inside. His body was still tense from the confrontation at the veterans' office, the sting of their dismissal echoing in his mind. Too late, best forgotten. The words replayed again and again, each repetition hardening his anger into something heavier, sharper. Emily was at a neighbor's for the afternoon, one of the few families who still offered small kindnesses when they could. That gave Daniel a rare moment to sit alone, his thoughts churning. He knew he couldn't stay silent anymore, not after what he had found. The truth deserved to be heard, even if those in power wanted it buried. But where did he begin? How did a man with no voice make himself heard? It was then he noticed her, Sarah Collins. She was standing near the docks with a notebook in hand, her gaze scanning the harbor as though every corner of it held a story. She was in her early 30s, dressed in jeans and a light jacket, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. There was an energy about her, a sharpness in her eyes, a restlessness in her movements that reminded Daniel of sailors before a storm, ready to act, ready to chase whatever came. He had seen her before, scribbling notes during community meetings or snapping photographs at rallies. She was a reporter for the Charleston Herald, known for digging where others chose not to look. Daniel hesitated, torn between mistrust and desperation. But something in her presence, the focus in her eyes, the way she seemed to really see people, made him rise to his feet and approach. "Miss Collins," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She turned, surprised to hear her name. "Yes?" "I've read some of your work," Daniel said, shifting the flag in his hands. "You write the stories no one else will touch. Stories about people who've been overlooked." Her curiosity sharpened. "That's the goal," she said carefully. "Why do you ask?" Daniel hesitated only a moment before placing the folded flag on the bench between them. His hands lingered on it, as though letting go would cost him something. "Because I think I have one of those stories." Sarah's gaze flicked from his face to the flag, then back again. "Go on." Slowly, as if each word were pulled from a place deep inside him, Daniel told her everything. The storm that had nearly killed him and his men, the fishermen they had rescued, the sacrifice it had demanded. He described finding the letter, the nomination for the Silver Star, the way it had been buried for reasons he still didn't understand. His voice wavered at times, but his eyes never left hers, steady and unflinching. When he was finished, Sarah sat silent for a moment, her pen hovering above her notebook. She finally reached for the papers, scanning them quickly, her brows knitting as she read the Navy's seal, the language of the commendation, the cruel dismissal stamped across the bottom. This is, she shook her head, her voice low. This is huge. If this is true, and from what I see here, it looks undeniable, this isn't just your story. It's the city's story. It's the Navy's story. People need to hear it. Daniel's chest tightened, a flicker of hope sparking. Then you'll write it? Sarah looked at him, her expression steady but serious. I will, but you need to understand something. Once this goes out there, there's no turning back. The officials you confronted will fight to silence you. The Navy may close ranks. People will dig into your life, your service, your failures. You'll be praised by some, attacked by others. And Emily, she paused, softening. Emily may find herself in the middle of it too. Are you ready for that? Daniel's hands tightened on his knees. He thought of Emily, her quiet strength, her resilience in the face of every cruelty thrown her way. She had borne so much already, more than any child should. Would it be fair to drag her into another battle? But then he remembered the way she had looked at him lately, the silent questions in her eyes, the doubt that crept into her voice when she asked if things would ever get better. For her, he had to fight. For her, he had to prove that his silence did not define him. Yes, he said finally, his voice rough but certain. I'm ready. Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded. She slid the papers back into the envelope and tucked it into her bag with a kind of reverence. All right, Mr. Harris. Then let's tell the city who you really are. As she walked away, her pen already scratching across her notebook, Daniel felt the weight in his chest shift. The rage was still there, the betrayal still raw, but now there was something else, a current of possibility. For years he had lived as though invisible. Now, for the first time in a long time, he felt the eyes of the world beginning to turn toward him. He didn't yet know how fierce the storm ahead would be, but as the harbor wind whipped against his face, Daniel Harris knew one thing with unshakable certainty. The truth would no longer be hidden. The article hit the presses on a Tuesday morning, buried on page 1 of the Charleston Herald beneath the usual noise of politics and city updates. But by midday, it was no longer just a story, it was the story. Sarah Collins had written with precision and fire, weaving together Daniel's service, the letter of recommendation for the Silver Star, the bureaucratic silence that followed, and the cold dismissal he had received only days before. She had photographed the ragged flag, its seams torn and weary, the folded letter peeking from its fabric. The headline was impossible to ignore. Hero buried in silence. Navy veterans, bravery forgotten, justice denied. By the afternoon, Charleston was in uproar. Local television stations picked it up first, reading excerpts of the article on evening broadcasts. By nightfall, it was circulating across national wires, shared online with captions that fanned outrage. How could this happen? Why was he silenced? Who buried the truth? Comment sections swelled with fury, sympathy, and disbelief. For the first time in years, Daniel's name was not whispered in pity or contempt, but shouted in admiration. Veterans rallied outside the courthouse, their old uniforms and caps worn proudly as they carried signs demanding recognition for one of their own. Citizens who had once crossed the street to avoid him now stood with him, speaking into cameras, recalling how they had seen him quietly tending the graves of fallen soldiers, how they had watched him and Emily scrape by with dignity despite the weight pressing against them. Emily felt the shift most acutely. The morning the article was published, she had braced herself for the usual sneers and whispers at school. But instead of scorn, she was met with wide-eyed stares. Her classmates passed copies of the newspaper across their desks, pointing to the photograph of Daniel standing solemnly beside the flag. By recess, the same children who had mocked her shoes and called her father crazy were suddenly asking her questions with awe in their voices. "Is it true your dad saved all those men?" one boy asked, his voice tinged with something like respect. Emily straightened, her small hands tightening on her lunch bag. "Yes," she said firmly, the shame that had shadowed her for so long beginning to lift. For the first time, she felt proud to carry his name. Back at home, Daniel was overwhelmed. He had never wanted attention, never wanted cameras or strangers chanting his name. Yet when he stepped outside his door that evening, a crowd had gathered on the street. Neighbors who had once ignored him now stood with candles, veterans saluting as he passed. Someone placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering, "We've got your back." But with the wave of support came pressure. The city could not ignore the outcry. By the end of the week, the mayor, long seen as a polished figure who rarely touched the city's deeper wounds, was forced to address the situation. His office released a statement acknowledging the article and promising a public hearing to review the matter thoroughly. It was more than Daniel had expected, but less than the people demanded. Crowds continued to grow, chanting outside City Hall, veterans lining the steps with flags held high. Signs appeared on street corners: "Honor our hero. Justice delayed is justice denied." Inside his small living room, Daniel watched it all unfold on the television. Emily sat beside him, her eyes wide as she pointed to the screen. "They're talking about you, Daddy." His throat tightened. He thought of the years when her world had been filled with silence, when her classmates had treated her like the daughter of a ghost. Now she was looking at him with pride, her eyes shining. Still, he knew pride alone would not be enough. The officials who had buried his commendation once would not surrender it easily. A hearing was only the beginning, and hearings had a way of becoming spectacles designed to pacify the public without delivering the truth. Yet as he looked at Emily, at her shoulders finally straightening beneath the weight she had carried, Daniel felt a new kind of resolve. This was no longer just about his honor. It was about giving her a name she could carry proudly into the world. It was about proving that silence, no matter how deep, could be broken. The city had awakened. The mayor had been forced into the open. The truth had begun to crawl out from the shadows, and Daniel Harris, who had once believed he was destined to fade into obscurity, now found himself at the center of a storm too powerful to contain. The day of the hearing arrived with an air thick enough to taste. The city's council chambers, usually half empty and dull with routine agendas, were now bursting at the seams. Veterans in pressed jackets filled the front rows, their caps resting solemnly on their laps. Reporters crowded the aisles, cameras perched on tripods, microphones flashing red lights like restless eyes. Outside, a sea of people waved flags and held signs that read, "Honor Daniel Harris, and truth can't be buried forever." Daniel sat quietly at the center table, Emily clutching his hand as though her grip alone could anchor him. Sarah Collins sat on his other side, a small recorder in her bag and a calm fire in her eyes. For Daniel, this was not just a hearing, it was Judgment Day, and not only for him. When the mayor entered, flanked by polished officials, the chamber fell into a heavy silence. His expression carried the stiffness of a man walking a tightrope, balancing between appeasing the furious public and protecting the machinery that kept him in power. The proceedings began with polite words, acknowledgments of Daniel's service, platitudes about sacrifice. But beneath the sheen of courtesy, Daniel sensed the trap tightening. It came quickly, masked as formality, but sharpened with venom. An official from the Veterans Affairs Office stood, papers clutched in his hand. His voice was steady, rehearsed, as he addressed the crowd and the cameras. "While we recognize Mr. Harris's service to this nation, there remain questions about the authenticity of the documents presented. Records of a Silver Star recommendation do not appear in the Navy archives. Furthermore, no official report confirms the alleged incident at sea." A ripple moved through the room. Daniel's chest burned, but he forced himself to remain still, though every muscle begged to rise, to shout, to demand the truth. The official continued, his words precise, designed to plant doubt. It is possible, even likely, that Mr. Harris has perhaps unintentionally misinterpreted or even embellished these events. After all, memory can be a fragile thing, and one must consider the risk of tarnishing the integrity of our nation's honors with unverified claims. Gasps spread through the chamber. Some of the crowd shouted in protest. Others sat in stunned silence. The camera lenses swung toward Daniel, waiting for his reaction, hungry for the sight of a man undone. Emily's grip on his hand tightened. He lowered his gaze to her small, determined face, her lips pressed together in defiance. That single look gave him the strength to endure the storm. Before Daniel could rise to defend himself, Sarah stood. She moved to the podium with the grace of someone who had been waiting for this moment. Her voice, firm but not raised, cut clean through the noise. With all due respect, what you've just witnessed is an attempt to erase a man's sacrifice for the convenience of bureaucracy. But facts are stubborn things, and I didn't come here without them. From her bag, she pulled a slim folder, worn from being handled, but inside it lay the weight of testimony the officials had not expected. She held it up to the cameras, then opened it slowly. These are the words of survivors' men who were on those waters, men who were pulled back from the brink by Daniel Harris, fishermen who, without him, would not be alive today. She read aloud. First, the statement of a grizzled fisherman named Thomas Riley, describing the night of the storm, the capsizing boat, and the Navy diver who refused to quit until every last man was accounted for. Then another from Joseph Tanner, who recalled clinging to debris as Daniel hauled him through the black waves with a rope tied around his waist. And another, their words raw, unpolished but searing with truth. Each voice cracked through the chamber like lightning, stripping away the officials' polished denials. By the time Sarah lowered the final page, the silence was no longer heavy with doubt but trembling with outrage. The crowd erupted. Veterans rose to their feet, saluting Daniel with tears in their eyes. Citizens shouted at the officials, calling them cowards, liars, betrayers. Even some of the reporters, normally neutral observers, looked visibly shaken, scribbling furiously as if determined to etch every word into history. On live television, the mayor's face hardened, his rehearsed composure slipping beneath the heat of public fury. The officials who had tried to discredit Daniel shifted uneasily, their authority dissolving under the weight of truth. Daniel did not speak, not yet. He simply sat, Emily's hand still in his eyes lowered as though the roar of vindication belonged not to him, but to the memory of that night at sea, to the faces of the men he had dragged through salt water and fear. Sarah leaned closer, her voice low enough for only him to hear. They can't bury it anymore. Not after this. Daniel nodded slowly. For the first time in years, the weight pressing on his chest lifted, replaced by something unfamiliar hope, jagged and cautious, but real. The enemies had struck back with venom and doubt, but truth had its own weapons, and this time, truth had won. The days following the public hearing carried a strange electricity, a kind of collective awakening that Daniel had never imagined possible. For years, he had wandered invisible through streets that treated him as an afterthought, a broken veteran with nothing left to give. But now the same city that once passed him by stopped to listen, stopped to see. The testimonies Sarah revealed spread far beyond the council chambers. Newspapers across the state picked up the story. National outlets replayed the footage of veterans standing to salute Daniel and of citizens shouting down the officials who tried to silence him. Strangers stopped him on the street, pressing his hand, thanking him, telling him their fathers or brothers had once worn a uniform too. Yet Daniel did not crave applause. Deep inside, he felt the recognition was not his alone. It belonged to the men who had gone under the waves that night, to the voices lost before they could tell their side. And it belonged to the survivors, those who had looked death in the eye and still carried the weight of remembering. It was one of those survivors, Thomas Riley, who came to him first. They met on the edge of the docks where the gulls wheeled above and the water still smelled faintly of oil and salt. Thomas was older now, his hair gone silver, his hands rough with years of labor. But when he gripped Daniel's arm, his strength was unshaken. "We can't let them win by just exposing the truth," Thomas said, his voice steady with conviction. "We've got to build something out of it, a place, a promise. So no man who serves and sacrifices is ever forgotten again." Others came in the days that followed: Joseph Tanner, Miguel Alvarez, and 2 more fishermen who had survived that storm. They brought not only their stories, but their determination, their belief that the injustice Daniel endured could be turned into a legacy. Around a weathered table at a local diner, they mapped the first outlines of what they began calling Harbor of Hope. The idea was simple, yet profound. A community foundation dedicated to honoring forgotten veterans, supporting homeless soldiers, and preserving the memory of sacrifices erased by neglect. It would be a place where names were remembered, where stories were told, where no flag lay abandoned in a box for decades. At first, Daniel resisted. The thought of leading something, of standing as the face of hope, felt too heavy. He had spent so long with his shoulders bowed under the weight of silence that standing tall seemed impossible. But Emily's quiet eyes kept returning to him, filled with a belief he couldn't deny. "Dad," she whispered one evening as they sat on the steps outside their shelter, "maybe this is what you were meant for. Not just surviving, helping others survive too." Her words struck deeper than any speech. For the first time, Daniel began to believe that his suffering might carry a purpose larger than himself. When Sarah published a follow-up article about Harbor of Hope, the response was overwhelming. Letters poured in, donations followed, and ordinary citizens began showing up at planning meetings with sleeves rolled up, eager to help. Carpenters offered free labor, restaurant owners donated meals, teachers volunteered to run history workshops so children could learn the names of local veterans long forgotten. The transformation was astonishing. The same streets that once watched Daniel shuffle past in ragged clothes now saw him walking with a steadier step, his shoulders no longer stooped in shame but squared with responsibility. People greeted him not with pity but with respect. Some even asked him for guidance, how they could help, how they could give, how they could honor. It was not wealth Daniel gained, nor luxury, but something richer. He gained belonging, purpose, a voice that carried weight not because it shouted louder than others, but because it spoke with the unshakable honesty of lived truth. The first fundraising rally was held at the city's waterfront. Veterans stood beside school children, young families beside weathered fishermen. Music rose into the air, candles were lit, and banners reading Harbor of Hope stretched against the evening sky. Daniel took the stage reluctantly, his hands trembling as he gripped the microphone. "I never asked to be here," he began, his voice rough but steady. "For a long time, I thought my life was nothing but a burden. But what I carried, it wasn't meant to be buried. It was meant to be shared. Not for me, for the men who never came home, for those still fighting battles no one sees. Harbor of Hope isn't mine, it's ours. It belongs to every one of you who believes no sacrifice should be forgotten." A hush fell over the crowd, followed by a swell of applause that rolled like thunder against the water. Emily stood in the front row, tears streaking her cheeks, pride lighting her face. For her and for so many others, Daniel was no longer the man who had once been broken. He was a man reborn, a leader not by choice but by necessity, a leader of renewal, of remembrance, of hope. And as the candles flickered in the night, reflecting on the rippling harbor, it felt as though the city itself had begun to heal. What had started as one man's humiliation and anger had now become the birth of something far greater, a living promise that the forgotten would be remembered and the broken would be lifted again. The morning of the grand opening dawned clear and cool, as though the city itself had prepared a fresh canvas for the day. The once empty lot by the waterfront, where broken boards and rusting nails had long testified to neglect, now stood transformed. A broad archway stretched above the entrance. Hand-painted letters reading "Harbor of Hope," colorful banners swayed gently in the breeze, and the sound of tuning instruments drifted from a nearby bandstand. Veterans arrived first, some in wheelchairs, some walking with canes. Others with crisp uniforms pressed one last time for the occasion. Families followed, clutching flowers, photographs, and small flags that fluttered like whispers of memory. Children ran across the lawn, laughter echoing against the water. Their carefree joy carrying a kind of healing no speech could ever capture. Daniel stood among them, his heart pounding in his chest as if it were trying to leap out and meet the moment. For months, he had poured every ounce of himself into this vision with Thomas, Sarah, and the other survivors. He had worked beside carpenters, scrubbed floors, painted walls, and hauled supplies, not because it was expected, but because it was his own form of penance and renewal. And now, standing in the glow of morning, he could scarcely believe it was real. The ribbon stretched taut across the entryway, waiting for the scissors that would mark a new beginning. A crowd had gathered, filling the open space with murmurs of anticipation, the kind that carried the weight of history in the making. Daniel had not expected to speak, had not wanted the spotlight. But as the chatter settled into silence, all eyes turned toward him. And then from the front row, Emily stepped forward. She was no longer the timid girl who once hunched her shoulders under the ridicule of classmates. Today she stood straight, her chin lifted, her face glowing with both nervousness and pride. A hush fell as she raised her small voice, words trembling but strong enough to reach every corner of the gathering. "A flag may be torn," she said, her voice breaking slightly before she steadied it, "but loyalty and honor never fade." The words hung in the air like a sacred vow. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as though a single breath had passed through the crowd, the applause began soft at first, then swelling into a thunderous roar. Veterans saluted, parents wiped their eyes, children clapped with unfiltered joy. Daniel felt the tears he had long held back break free, rolling down his weathered face. For years he had lived in the shadow of silence and shame, carrying scars invisible to most. But in that instant, his daughter's words echoing against the harbor. The applause rising like a tide, he felt something shift deep within. The broken pieces of himself, scattered across too many years, seemed to knit together again. He reached for Emily, pulling her close as the crowd cheered louder still. She buried her face against his chest, her small arms wrapped tightly around him. And Daniel, once the forgotten veteran sleeping in corners of a city that pretended he didn't exist, now stood tall at the center of a new beginning. The ribbon was cut. The doors opened. Inside, the community center gleamed with hope. Walls bore the names of local veterans etched in bronze. Rooms stood ready for counseling, for meals, for learning. A corner was dedicated to the fishermen lost at sea, with a mural of waves breaking into light, a reminder that memory itself can be a kind of anchor. As people streamed inside, laughter and music filled the air, blending with the steady hum of conversation. Sarah moved through the crowd with her notepad tucked away, not as a reporter today, but as a friend. Thomas shook hands with men he hadn't seen in decades. Volunteers carried trays of food, while children pointed at the photographs lining the walls, asking questions their parents were finally ready to answer. Daniel remained on the steps a moment longer, watching it all unfold. His chest ached with emotion, not from the emptiness of old wounds, but from the fullness of something he thought he would never know again: wholeness. For the first time in years, he did not feel like a ghost wandering among the living. He was here, present, woven back into the fabric of his community. And as the sun lifted higher over the harbor, its light reflecting off the waters that had once carried so much sorrow, Daniel felt the truth settle in his bones. Redemption had not come through revenge or recognition alone. It had come through remembrance, through building something that outlasted pain, through finding meaning in what was nearly lost. He looked down at Emily, her small hand clasped in his, and then at the sea of faces around them: veterans, families, children, citizens united by a common vow. The applause still rang in his ears, but it was her words that lingered deepest. A flag may be torn, but loyalty and honor never fade. And with that truth, Daniel finally knew he was whole again.